Okay. Shavua Tov, Boker Tov. I hope everyone has sheets. Okay. So the shiur is dedicated to Ilui Nishmat Rafael Moshe ben Eliyahu, and we are speaking today about Rav Chaim Palachi. It can be written either the way that is written here, with an Aleph Gimel Yud, or sometimes they spell it with a tzadik, Palachi. The truth is there is no such a Hebrew syllable, chi. So you can just write it in different ways. All of them are inaccurate. And so that's his name, Rav Chaim Palachi. He was born in 1788. So technically, we are still in the 18th century. But you can understand that if someone was born in 1788, his activity would not be in the 18th century, but in the 19th century. 1788. So his activity would be mainly at the 19th century. He was born in Izmir. Izmir was a very important, for the Jews, a very important Jewish Turkish city. Obviously, there was no Turkey back then. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And just to give some background, so back then, the Jews in again, what is today Turkey, was an important and vibrant and dynamic community, a community with sages, community with chachamim, with rabbanim, with sofrim. He himself, meaning Rav Chaim Palachi, about whom we would speak today, when he is writing his own tzava'ah, his own last will, so that's around 1865. So around 1865, deep into the 19th century, he is still writing. You can see it in the first source that עירנו אזמיר עיר המהוללה ביראת השם ובקיום המצוות. So our city Izmir is known, is famed for the reverence of God and for fulfilling the commandments, the mitzvot. ואם שום אחד נחשד על חילול שבת, it should be אין. ואין שום אחד נחשד על חילול שבת. There's no even one who is suspected on violating the Shabbat. Now, we are, as I said, deep into the 19th century. If you'd compare it to Berlin in the 19th century, or even to Warsaw in the 19th century, then unfortunately, you cannot say this sentence of there is not even one suspected on violating the Shabbat. So Izmir is very different. ולפעמים כשאירע חס ושלום אחד מעיר שבא לידו בשוגג חילול שבת. So maybe sometimes one in a blue moon it would happen that someone would inadvertently he would fail in חילול שבת. ותגעש ותרעש הארץ ונעשה חרדה בכל העיר. So that would be a whole event, public event, that someone broke in the Shabbat by mistake. והחוטא תכף ומיד מקבל עליו תיקון על חילול שבת במלכות ו4 מיתות בית דין. So he immediately would be corrected, right, punished by malkot, by whip, by the lash, ו4 מיתות בית דין, and 4 type of deaths of בית דין, ונידוי, and he'd be excommunicated, ותענית, and be fasting, וקנס, and it would be fined, ותיקון כרת. So I'm not sure if all of that would happen to the same person, but so that's a little hyperbolic. It's a little hyperbolic, but the point I think is conveyed clearly, and that is that still in the 1860s, the community of Izmir, and by large, the Turkish community is in a much better shape, if we may say that, Jewishly, than in Europe. Now, as Be'ezrat Hashem, as we would finish the shiur, I would speak about his legacy, and I would also speak about what happened to the Turkish community. It didn't stay that way. But at least for as long as he was alive, these were more or less the conditions he was enjoying. So he's born into this very vibrant Jewish community. Both his father and his mother were from a very prominent rabbinical families. The name of his mother was Kali Kadin, which is a Turkish name, as happened in many Jewish communities in the diaspora. Many times the name of the boys would bigly would remain Jewish, but the name of the girls, the daughters, would be many times named according to the local names. So you'd find it also in Europe. So the boys would usually be called in a Hebrew name, or at least they would have also a Hebrew name, while the girls many times would have only a non-Hebrew name. And that also happened in the Muslim diaspora. So we have his mother, Kali Kadin. Her father was no other than the Chacham Bashi. So he was the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Rabbi Yosef Raphael Chazan. He authored the very famous halachic responsa named Chikri Lev. So many times he's called after this work either the Chikri Lev or he's called HaChakal, Chet Kuf Lamed. That is Chikri Lev, Chakal. Now it's a play of words because the word Chakal in Aramaic means a field, and Chakal Tapuchin Kadishin, that means the field of the holy apples, which doesn't mean much to us, but that's like a very famous Kabbalistic metaphor of Chakal Tapuchin Kadishin. So Chakal is the name that was used for this rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Raphael Chazan, and he would later make Aliyah and reside in Yerushalayim. But when our hero is being born, he still lives in Izmir. And the first years of Rav Chaim Palachi would be under the tutelage of his grandfather, who is, as I said, a very famous and important rabbi. Is from his father's side, that's from his mother's side. From his father's side, his father is Rabbi Yaakov ben Rabbi Chaim, so he's called after his grandfather from his father's side. And you remember that by the Sephardic tradition, you are not being called after someone after he's dead, but when he's still alive. So he's being born, and he's named after his grandfather Chaim, and his own father, as I said, is Yaakov. Now he's writing about his father Yaakov. Look here in source bet. Hu haya gibor Chaim. So it's our hero Rabbi Chaim speaking about his father Rabbi Yaakov. Hu haya gibor Chaim ben milchamta shel Torah. So he was a soldier, a hero in the war of Torah. Chatana de Veinesia. He was the in-law of the house of the president. The house of the presidency means, obviously, here is mother's father. So he says, my father was famous for marrying into the family of my mother. Chatana de Veinesia. So he's the son-in-law of the Chacham Bashi. V'kiyem gdola shimusha. So he was always serving my grandfather. Again, not his own father, not the father of the father, but my father was serving the father of my mother. Asher yatzak mayim al yado shel Rabbeinu Agadol Mar Chamiv. So he would serve, he would give water on the hands of our great rabbi. His meaning my father's father-in-law. This is the gown my grandfather, Zichro Lechayei Haolam Haba, Ugdolim Chikri Lev. So he is named after his great book, Chikri Lev, Keman de Manach Bekiste. So my father learned the books of my father-in-law, and they were like in his pocket. So he knew them so well. They were like in his pocket. Bechol makom sheshoalim oto baki behem. Every place he would be asked from the books of his in-law, he would be baki. He would know an answer. Doleu mashke mitorat rabo. He would teach the Torah of his father-in-law. ועל הכל לא עבר עליו חצות גם קיץ גם חורף. He says, my father never slept after midnight. Now again, that's a very changed word from the word we are used to. In our world, maybe people do not go to sleep till midnight because we have electricity. But back then, people would go to sleep more or less after צאת הכוכבים, after nightfall, but many times they would wake up either around midnight. Also, midnight is not necessarily an exact timing, so it can be 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. You know that it's very difficult to know when it's midnight. It's very easy to know when it's midday, because you can look at the sun. Where would you look in order to know that it is midnight? So midnight is a general term, but he never slept through midnight, either in the summer, which is in which the nights are long, the nights are short, or in the winter when the nights are long. וישכם יעקב, so Yaakov, the name of his father, he would always wake up. והיה קורא בספר הזוהר הקדוש בהתלהבות גדול. So he would wake up at midnight and he would read with much of enthusiasm and very loudly the ספר of the זוהר. ולפעמים היה נותן את קולו בבכי, sometimes he would cry. והכל קול יעקב היה מעורר אותי לקום. So he says, as the son, I would wake up for my father reading the Zohar every night at midnight. But he's not complaining. He's not complaining. But that's the type of house he was growing up in. והוא בסובלי חולאים. דעה כמה שנים נתקלקל האצטומחה שלו. So now when he writes that his father is already old, and he says he's suffering. He is suffering from sicknesses, and for few years, his itztumcha is the stomach. So his stomach has been dysfunctional. V'kaivle keive, and it was so hurting, עד שהיה מוציא כל מה שהיה אוכל. Everything he eats, he vomits. ולא היה לו מנוחה, כי אם ביום שהיה מתענה. He can only rest when he's fasting, when he's not eating. לא היו ימים טובים לו, כי ימי ראש השנה. The best days for him were ראש השנה. Why ראש השנה? The 2 days of ראש השנה, שהיה מתענה בשני הימים. So on ראש השנה, he would fast both days. No apple in the honey for Rabbi Yaakov Palachi. So he would fast for both days, מבחרותו, from young age, מסיבת חלום, because he once dreamed a dream on Rosh Hashanah, which caused him to fast, and from there on he would fast throughout his life on Rosh Hashanah. ועם כל זה, so after all of this suffering and illness and all of the problems, היה לי להד'ר עז'ר בכל פינות, וכל שהוא עיקר בצורכי הבית, כי הוא היה מכניס ומוציא כדי שלא יתבטל מלימודי. So my father, he would take upon himself the needs of the house. So he would clean, he would make sure that there is food, שלא יתבטל מלימודי. Now we are not speaking about the age of 10. We'll see, we're speaking about the age of 35. At 35, his father would work, his father would sustain him, and he would just sit down and learn. ולא עוד, אלא שכל עניין שהייתי גומר מלכתוב, היה הוא מעתיק אותו. That is not enough. When he would, Rav Chaim says, our hero says, when I would finish writing something, my father would take it and copy it into a nice form. So you can say that his father dedicated his life to a large degree for his son to become a super rabbi. So his father is not speaking, I'm sure he's also a Talmid Chacham, but from this words, it seems that his father was very devoted to the father-in-law, which was a great rabbi, and very devoted to his son to create, to continue the legacy of great rabbis. ורובי תורתי מרוב ספרי צדיק עת'ק. So most of my Torah, for most of my Sefarim, he was a very prolific writer. He wrote around 80 books, Rabbi Chaim Palachi. And his father copied many of them. ויגל יעקב לעתיקם, he was happy to copy them. מידי אביר יעקב. So he says, I am the אביר יעקב, right? I am the knight of Yaakov. And he was happy to copy them from my hands, בשעשוע גדול, and that was not something that he saw as a bother, but that was something that he saw as a mission, as a goal, as something that to be desired. Okay, so that's the family is growing in. Obviously, he is designated as many of the rabbis that we spoke about. So it's not something that... There are very few Rabbi Akivas that in the age of 40 understood that they can learn Torah and then they become rabbis. There are a few people like that, but that's very rare. Most of the great rabbis that we spoke about, regardless of in Ashkenaz or in Sfad or in other places, they knew from a very young age they were geniuses and they were designated by their families or by their teachers to become leaders and Torah scholars. And he was not different in that area. He writes about himself, מעיד אני עלי שמיים וארץ, source ג'. So he says, I take it as a testimony. I ask the heavens and the earth to witness on me. כי מיום דעתי עד יום היותי בן 20 שנה, הייתי שוקד על לימודי ביום ובלילה בלי שום ביטול. He says, from the age I understood what I am doing to the age of 20, I sat down and learned and never ever canceled my learning, stopped my learning even for a bit. So who can give such a testimony on himself? So what can we say? So from the age that what age would it be? 12, 13, 14, 15, 18. To the age of 20, he says, I never stopped learning. Okay, what happened in the age of 20? In the age of 20, he got married. So, מבין 20 ועד 40, from 20 to 40, the talu beitiflei, I began to have small children, לא הייתי מתעסק בענייני, הייתי מתעסק בענייני העולם, להיות מורשה ואפוטרופוס ומתוך בכמה עניינים, ועם כל זה שלא היה לי עסק, לא הייתי פונה לשום עניין שחוק ועיתול ודברי בטלה, כי אם לחזור על לימודי. So he says, from the age of 20 to 40, I had small children. I also had some businesses, it seems, with taking care of other people. But he says that was the only thing I was doing. As in the minute I didn't have these type of very important things to attain to, I returned to my learning. So it was not 100% as it had been. But again, he didn't need to make parnasa because his father took care of him to the age of 40. So speaking about staying at the father's house for long. So he remained till the age of, maybe he moved to another house, but obviously his father took care of him. In another place, he writes very fondly that the real way a family should be is that you should have like the grandfather or the father of the house and the mother of the house, and then all of their children and grandchildren all living in the same yard, what we call today. Mula, we call it today. So it seems that that's the way that he was used to. So his father really took care of everything. And to the age of 40, with the small exception of sometimes, I guess, having to wake up for his own children crying at night, he was just sitting and learning.
Talking from your heart.
Apologize to our dear neighbors for... Yeah, but the part of that, he was sitting, and then to the age of 40. At the age of 40, his father passed away. And then he had to take a role as a dayan, as a judge, a halachic judge in the halachic court. מבין 40 ומעלה, אז נכנסתי להיות דיין ושופט ומורה צדק, ולהיטפל בצורכי רבים עד עצם היום הזה. Now again, this is from the book צוואה. This is from his will, last will. Everything he did, it had to take 60 pages at least. So that's how he wrote 80 books. So he wrote a tzavaha, it's not only 2 pages. It's a whole book that's called the tzavaha, his last will. So he writes that again around the age of 75. He died 81. So around the age of 75, he writes this tzavaha, this last will, and he says, from the age of 40 to this day, I am bothered, I'm engaged with the needs of the community, כי עלה מדי שנה בשנה עול הציבור הרבה מאוד, כי אין רגע בלי פגע. So he says, the public, from every year, they demand more of my time. אין רגע בלי פגע. There is no minute in which I am not being bothered with something. מבעלי דינים וצורכי ציבור, מהעיר עצמה, וכל סיבות, so people coming from the city, people coming, well, he was a very famous rabbi, so people are coming also from the whole state. וגם כי נתווסף מנימוסי המלכות ירום הודע, על ידי שנתן ממשלה להרב מורה צדק, לחתום בגושפנקה דמלכה ירום הודו, ולהיות ניסן מבית המלכות. I would explain that. He was given himself after the death of his father, after his grandfather, at the year 1857. He was 69 and he became the Chacham Bashi himself and was granted permission and authority from the Turkish Sultan. So he had his own small private army, and if he could force his opinion on the Jewish community, which, as we would think, he did. He certainly did. He certainly used this authority. I don't know if he used the soldiers, mamash, but it seems that for sure he threatened using them. So he said, I received a great responsibility. But together with this responsibility, obviously comes the need to invest my time and energy in all of these public matters. So I cannot learn Torah as I had wanted. וליבי דואג בקרבי. So my heart is aching. על שאיני יכול לעסוק בתורה כחפצי ורצוני. That I cannot engage in Torah learning as I would have wanted. So after all of this kavod that I have, all of this respect, all of this honor that people give me, and I am honored by both the Jews and the non-Jews. But truth is, I would like to return to the age of, 30, when I was just sitting and my father would take care of everything and I would sit down and learn. So that he writes, as I said, around the age of 75. But now let's return to our Rav Chaim Palachi when he was young. At the age of 20, before getting married, he is getting smicha, ordination, rabbinic ordination, from his grandfather. His grandfather is granting him an ordination, a smicha. And so again, I don't know, as a smicha project, he writes one of his first books, which is called Smicha מחיים. Now, as I said, he had around 80 books, 80 sefarim. He had more, but around 80 survived. And almost all of them, not all, but almost all of them had the word Chaim inside their name. So you'd have Tzedakah Mechayim, Masa Chaim, Melech V'Chaim, the list goes on, and Tzava'a Mechayim, and his first book is called Smicha Lechaim. Now, what is interesting in this book is that he wrote it together with his grandfather. So he's 20, his grandfather is 60 or 70, and they are writing the book together. So his grandfather would be given sheilot. He would give the sheila, the question, to his grandson. The grandson would write an answer, a responsa, and then the grandfather would write his own comments on the responsa, and they would publish it in the book. So that's the way that the book is written. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. I will just read with you a part of the first answer in the Sefer, because it's a fascinating book. So I don't know if you are able to read. I sat yesterday night, and it was either typing it myself, because I couldn't find it typed in anywhere. So it was either typing it myself or just copying it, with a paste and copy. I chose the easy route. I hope that it's readable.
You say that you wanted to show them how it looks.
Yeah, that's how. Yeah, exactly. I wanted you to see how the book looks like. Thank you. So now you see. Now you say, why didn't you type it after you saw? Okay, so the sheila is, במנהג הנהוג בעירנו זאת אזמיר ישמריה עליון אמן. So the minhag in our city Izmir, God should save it. הבוקר אור ביום שבת קודש בתפילת שחרית. So when the sun is rising up and it's morning, it's Shabbat morning. I'm in source Daled in the right column. Yes. דכשיש שמחות וגיל לאיזה יחידי מיחידי החברה הקדושה של קברים, כגון שמחת חתונה, או שהוא אבי הבן ובעל ברית, או שהוא מקדיש ספר תורה לבית הכנסת, או שהוא חתן תורה ביום שמחת תורה. בכל אלו הסמכות נהגו ראשי וזקני החברה הקדושה על הזו, והפרנסים והגזברים, עם קצת יחידים מהחברה, בהיקבץ יחד כולם כאחד אל מקום אחד, וללכת ולבוא לבית הכנסת אשר שם עומד ומתפלל היחיד זה מהחברה הנזכרת, שהשמחה במעונו, ולבקר אותו באותו בית הכנסת. So, basically, they were divided to חבורות. Now, it was called חבורת קברים, a graves group. Now, it doesn't sound so nice, but I would explain you why. The basic agreement between this every group was that when every one of us in the end, they say there are two things you cannot run away from. It's death and taxes. So when death comes, taxes you really cannot help, but death, when it comes, then they had groups, and the group would take care of the tahara and the levaya and the burial and the shiva afterwards. So they were like a chavurot, a groups of chesed shel emet. Later, and in other places, it became there is one group called the Chevra Kadisha, which would perform this test for the whole city. But in some places, it was people would be divided to groups. In Chutz La'aretz, in some places to this day, I think that the shul you are a member of, that's your group that will take care of your burial. Now, it may be very big, but it's the same condition. So these were the groups. They were called Chavurot Kvarim. But they were not only friends regarding the burial. It made them into a nice, happy bunch. Okay. So, thinking about connecting people. Now, they had this minhag that if someone of the Chavura had some simcha, so there was a baby born, or he was dedicating a Sefer Torah to the shul, or he had a wedding, whatever may be the case, so on Shabbat you would get maftir, right, in shul. Beautiful. The whole bunch should gather. Now, they would be in different shuls in the city, but for the maftir, they would all come to hear his maftir in shul and, I don't know, throw candies. Okay, very nice. What is the question? So we continue. השליח ציבור אומר מי שברך שמתנדבים בעלי החברה הנזכרת מתנת ידיהם לחיי בעל השמחה הנזכר, ונכנסים בשלום ונפטרים לשלום. ויען שנהגו לעשות זה הביקור ביום שבת קודש בשחרית, בעת התפילה ובשעת קריאת ספר תורה, שאז הוא זמן תפילה לכל, גם לראשי וזקני החברה, ודישרין סמיכין עליהון. וכשהשמש מהחברה נזכרת הולך ובא לקרוא לראשי החברה והיחידים, כדי להזמינם ולקבצם שיבואו למקום אחד, הוא מוציא לכל אחד ואחד מהם בבית הכנסת שלו, שהוא שומע קריאת התורה בציבור. Now, there is no WhatsApp group to send on Friday that there is a simcha. So the way it would work is that on Shabbat morning, there would be a shamash, there would be a servant. He would have a list of the friends he's supposed to call, and he would come to the shul, and he would say, Ploini, Almoini, and Zalmoini, please come with me. And then he would go to the next shul, and he would call another 2 or 3 guys, and he would gather all the friends, and they would all go then to the shul where the simcha is being conducted. So just imagine that. It was in the middle of Kriyat Torah in one shul, and the servant would come, take 3 guys out, 10 minutes later, another servant would come, take another 2 guys out. It became like a train station. So in all shuls in Izmir, people would go in and out and visit one place and go from one place. Also, many of them would not be able to hear Kriyat Torah, because if they call you in the middle of Kriyat Torah in one place, till you'd come to the other place, maybe you'd come in time for maftir, but you didn't listen to the whole of Kriyat Torah. So that's the question they asked him. Or I don't know if they asked him, or he asked, should I prevent that? ומוכרחים הם להניח הספר תורה בעוד שהשליח ציבור הוא עומד וקורא, ולפעמים העת בחוץ ויוצאים אפילו באמצע פסוק ממש, כאשר עינינו הרואות. So he says, we see in our own eyes. Sometimes they leave the shul in the middle of reading. So he's not happy with that. So the question is it mutar or asur? He goes deeply for 3 or 4 pages with this small scratchy writing into proofs. First, he wants to discuss, is the obligation to hear the Kriyat Torah, is it an obligation of the whole community, or is it an obligation on every yachid, every individual? If it's on the community as a whole, it means that I as an individual may skip Kriyat Torah. I just have to make sure that the community as a community is reading the Torah. If it's an obligation on every individual, then obviously I cannot just live in the middle and go to the other place. After some discussion, he comes to the conclusion that it is an obligation of the community. So it's not, maybe it's not something that is good that you live in the middle, but there is no halachic, at least, obligation to listen to the whole Kriya. Fine. Next question. Is it appropriate to live in the middle of the reading? So again, he discussed that. He brings proofs for and against. And his conclusion is, look at the left side in source Dalet, the big letters. Zot Torat ha'olah. This is my conclusion, he says. לצאת באמצע הקריאה, בעוד שהשליח ציבור קורא, בוודאי איסור גמור. He says to live in the middle when the שליח ציבור stands up and he is reading the Torah. You're just living while the Torah is being read. He says that's איסור גמור. It's completely forbidden. מדינא דש"ס וכל הפוסקים. He says that's the Gemara forbids it and all the poskim agree. There is nothing to ask. One should not leave. By the way, that's halacha. One should not leave shul when the Torah is being read, because we cannot understand why. Imagine that someone is speaking and you are just leaving. That's very, I don't know, it's insulting. So if the Torah is being read and you are just leaving, that's a great sign of disrespect. And he says, מה מנהג שייך נגד הש"ס והפוסקים, ושהם נוהגים באין מבין, ושהם נוהגים באין מבין. He says, now people claimed that that's the custom around here. That's our minhag, that we are living in the middle of the reading to go to the simcha. He says there is no minhag when the minhag is to do something which is forbidden. So that's the end of this story. Now, what about living ben gavra le gavra? Meaning after one finished his own bracha, right? We have 7 people that stand up to the Torah. Now, what if you leave the shul not in the middle of the laning, but in between? In between. So he says, לצאת בין גברא לגברא, אם שלדעת כל הפוסקים הנזכרים לאל, באינן שיהיה צורך גדול. He says it is correct that according to the poskim, even to live in between, only in a case of a great need, not just because the hang of it. But he says maybe to have this minhag ben adam lechaveiro, and you don't want to cancel the minhag. He says maybe that is allowed. So that is the conclusion of the 20-year-old guy, Rav Chaim Palachi. That is, don't do it in the middle of the kriya, do it in between. Now, it's very, very interesting. Now, the next response in the book, Siman Bet, is by his grandfather. And his grandfather is discussing a little the sugiot that his grandson had discussed, but then he comes to the conclusion, and it's such a so different atmosphere, gist, which really emphasizes the difference between a young guy that just finished yeshiva and a very seasoned and experienced community rabbi. So he's discussing halacha a little. And then he says, you know, it may be that for a great need you are allowed to live in between the people that stand up to the Torah. However, there is no great need here. Why? We have vatikin minyan. So you can go to the vatikin, and then you would not have to live in the middle of the reading of the Torah, and that's it. And that's why you're not allowed to live in the middle of the reading. So it's so interesting, because you see the young Talmid Chacham coming out of the yeshiva, his tools are the tools that he learned in the yeshiva. What did he learn in the yeshiva? The Milchamta Shel Torah, right? To discuss the Torah text, the halachic text. So that's what he's doing. He is not trying to give you a practical solution. He's trying to give you an halachic solution. He was asked an halachic question. Are you allowed to live in the middle of the tefillah for this reason? And he gives you the answer. But the community, the seasoned community rabbis knows that the real question, I don't know, maybe I'm a little exaggerating, but the real questions are not halachic. The real questions are practical. How do you manage your community? Because it may be the correct halachic answer to allow them to live in between the gavra, it is wrong as a communal practice that people would live in the middle. So he says, we have a practical solution. Go to Vatikin. If you cannot go to Vatikin, you don't have an excuse to go and abandon the reading, even in between the people that stand up to the Torah. So that's just an interesting, I think, dynamics. Obviously, as Rav Chaim Palachi would grow up and experience more and more, he don't worry, he is going to be an excellent practical rabbi. No question about that. And you'd understand matters of policy. But here, in a very young age, I thought it's very interesting to see these dynamics between him and his grandfather. Okay. So that was as I said, in the age of 20, he's getting his smicha, his ordination, and he's getting married. His wife, we know her name. Her wife was Esther, or Esterle, the way they called her. And it seems that she was a very fine woman, but also very sick. And she gave birth, if I remember correctly, to 3 boys and 1 daughter. And her son, in the Tzava'a Mechayim, in the last will of Rabbi Chaim, we have also some comments from his son. And his son describes his mother, and he says that she was always very weak and very sick, and she was niftar in a young age. As you see that it's a recurring theme. I think we spoke about it a few times. So she was niftar in a young age. However, in a book that Rabbi Chaim Palachi, one of the books that Rabbi Chaim Palachi wrote, which was named Tzedakah L'Chaim, and that's a book about, you can guess, tzedakah. So it's a book about tzedakah, donations. And there he describes how his wife would accept guests. And he says, every time there would be a simcha in our family, the first thing my wife would take care of is the tables of the poor. So that would be her first care. Only after she will see that the poor people were given their foods, only then she would have time to take care of the family and the other honored guests. So let's see it in source A. כך היא מידתה של נוות ביתי תבורך מנשים. So that's the way, the trait of my wife, that she should be blessed of all women. שכשיש בביתנו איזו שמחה וגיל, when in our home there is some happiness, ובכלל לעשות סעודה לעניים, and when there is a meal for the poor, אינה נותנת לאכול לשום אחד מהקרואים. No one is being given food. עד שמסדר את השולחנות לעניים בתחילה. So first she makes sure that there is food on the tables for the poor people. ואחר כך משימה שולחנות שיאכלו הקרואים. And the tables for the other guests are only later. שצריך ליתן לעניים משפירו ומתחילת המאכל, ולא למה שמשייר בסוף. Why she wanted the poor people not to feel that they are being given the leftovers from the other people. They should feel that they are being served the best food. So first served. Only later she would give to the other people. That's the trait of his wife. And it's also very beautiful, I think, to see that he would give his wife as an example for good midot. Okay. At the age, as I said, of 40, so that would be 1828, he became a dayan, and then he rose in the ranks, because it was very hierarchical. So you had a dayan, like a small district, and then you were a dayan of a more important part of the city, and then you became a dayan serving the whole city, then you became the Av Beidin, the master dayan of the city, and later he became the Chacham Bashi of the whole Ottoman Empire. So it took time. But in the beginning he was a dayan, and as he rose through the ranks, very quickly it became clear that he is not only relating to purely halachic matters, but it was very important for him also to take care of public policy questions. One of them that was very he make it his first priority almost, was questions of chinuch, education for the young. So, source Vav. כמה פעמים הוצאתי כרוז בכוח התורה? He says, few times I made a declaration with the authority of the Torah. I'm not sure what does it mean, the authority of the Torah. Is the authority as a Dayan? Maybe it means to say that it was before he got the authority from the Sultan. So I'm not sure what exactly כוח התורה means. But obviously he made it as strong as he could. שלא יוכל שום בר ישראל להוציא את בנו מבית הספר עד שידע כל התפילות השנה. So there was a minimum learning, חוק חינוך חובה. Every young boy had at least to know to daven from the siddur. Obviously, he wanted them to continue their learnings, but you are not allowed as a father to take your child out of school until he's being exempt and it is proven that he knows how to daven. That's very, very interesting. If you know how to daven, it means that you know how to read. Right? So they will teach him to read, they will teach him to use the siddur. And now it's very interesting. He knew that it's not enough just to give such a law, because fathers would still take their child out of school, and what can you do? So he also gave את הכנה, שום אומן לא יוכל לקבל לנערי ישראל ללמדו אומנות עד שידע סדר התפילות. His way to control that children would not be taken out of school too early is that he would make sure that they would not be hired. Because why would a father take out his child in a very young age from school? To work. There's no other reason. Now, I do not blame anyone. Obviously, some people were in poverty and they wanted their children to work. So at the age of 12 or 10, they would take their child out of school. So you'd learn in a cheder from the age of 5 to the age of 10. Very nice. I gave him 5 years and now go to work. And Rav Chaim Palachi would say to the people that have the omanut, how do you say, omanim? Artisans. So all the guilds, the different guilds. So he would issue a law. You are not allowed to hire a boy without him having a diploma from the school that he knows how to daven. And by that he blocked the interest of parents to take the children out of school. So you see that he learned something from this first tshuva, right, that we then spoke about. So that's a very interesting law. That's chok chinuch chova, that they must educate your child. He was against smoking. Now, in the middle of the 19th century, being against smoking is very, very unusual. He was against smoking. Now, he didn't know that it's unhealthy. How could he? They didn't know. So why was he against smoking? He had a few reasons. One was, basically, he was against everything that gave you too much pleasure. That was one reason. People should not be too, indulgent. But a part of that, he said, I am against smoking because it is addictive. And even if it is healthy, it is not good from a moral standpoint to be addicted to something. He also said it's a problem on Shabbat because you are getting addicted to smoking. And then on Shabbat, either that some people, it describes, some people wake up and even before they know what day it is, they immediately send their hand to the pipe or to the cigarette. He mentioned these two means of smoking. So they light it before they remember it's Shabbat. So it causes people to inadvertently break the Shabbat. And even people that remember the Shabbat, but they are sad and they are just waiting for the Shabbat to end in order to be able to smoke. He says, so it is hurting the Shabbat. And a part of that, as I said, it's immoral to be addicted to something which is not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he is against smoking. And he says with pride, I never smoked anything in my life. Not even cigarette, no. He never smoked anything. And he said, and I taught my children not to smoke. And now he didn't make a takana against smoking. He didn't go as far, but he really implored everyone reading his last will to stop smoking. And he says it's easier if you do not begin with it. So, yeah, good insight, exactly. So that's very, very unique and very interesting, and again, very much connected. So it was very much connected to reality. Another very important thing for him was, we already spoke about tzedakah. He wrote a whole book about tzedakah. And they had a very interesting minhag in Izmir and in some other Ottoman cities. And that was, it called Shabbat Halbasha, clothing Shabbat. Now, it was on Shabbat Parashat ותגעש. Usually it was around Hanukkah, so it is the middle of the winter, it's very cold. And Shabbat Halbasha was a Shabbat in which every family would bring clothes, and they would take the clothes and give it to the poor, and mostly to the melamdim. Because, again, history is repeating itself. Usually it were the same people. The melamdim, the teachers of the young, especially in the low classes, their salary would be very low, and they would be very poor. So they would use this Shabbat. It was called Shabbat Halbasha, and he would give 2 drashot on Shabbat Halbasha in the morning and in the afternoon. And drasha bahim, that's not a 7 minutes thing in here in Shul. That's a 70-minute thing. So the book Tzedakah LeChaim was a collection of his drashot from Shabbat Halbasha. He thought it's an extremely important institution, these donations of clothing. And as a matter of fact, after he passed away, they saw that in his handwriting of this book, of the manuscript of the Tzedakah Mechayim, he already wrote the drasha for the next year that he was not zoche to give. But the drasha was already there, and they saw it, his children and his community saw it as part of his will to continue this tradition of Shabbat Halbasha. It's a beautiful thing. So that was Shabbat Halbasha. He explains that Shabbat Halbasha has to do with both mitzvot, both of tzedakah, but also of Torah learning, because as I said, most of the people that you were donating to were the teachers of the young children. In 1840, when he was already an important figure in the Ottoman Empire, something very, very, very pivotal, we may say, very important, very central to the 18th century. I hope to give maybe 19th century, excuse me. I hope to give maybe a whole shiur around the events there and the people that were the heads there. So in 1840, you had the Damascus Affair. So what was the Damascus Affair? It was basically a blood label, an alilat dam. Usually we had these blood labels in Europe during the whole of the Middle Ages. But suddenly it was imported into the Muslim world, into Syria, into Damascus, and it is 1840. So it's, you have already free state in the United States. You have the French Revolution already happened. The Napoleon was already happened. And the world seems to be advancing. And suddenly you have something that was like taken from the 1400s and happening in Damascus. So they were blaming the rabbi, they were blaming the Jewish community for murdering a Christian boy and using his blood for matzah. And the way to prove such a thing was obviously a young Christian boy disappeared. So it's obviously the Jews that murdered him, right? That's one proof. And the other proof is to kidnap the Jews there and to torture them. And I mean, the tortures were really, really, really. I mean, if you want not to be able to eat your breakfast, then read what was happening on there. I mean, the smaller thing was that they not only tortured the Jews themselves, I mean, the people themselves, they took their children and tortured them to the eyes of the parents in order to make them admit. And that's only the beginning. So it's really, 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 it's very hard to speak about. But the Jews admit. The rabbi of Damascus admitted that they killed and murdered a Christian boy in order to use his blood for matzah, and everyone was celebrating in Damascus for being able to prove that the Jews are really what we always thought they are. And
Christian blood libel?
yeah, it was a Christian blood libel imported into Syria, because there were Christians also in Damascus. And the man, later it was discovered that the man that was advancing the whole thing was the French ambassador. Yeah, that's how things are. It was the French ambassador giving the locals some sense of European enlightenment. And by the way, it took a very strange turn in Iran right now. The blood libel going on in Iran, I mean, the conspiracy theory is because they had the whole thing confused with Purim. And it has to do with the Oznei Haman. I would not continue. It's really getting very, very strange, but you can find it online. And there are sites that are dedicated to these conspiracy theories. Returning to us. So in 1840, as I said, there was this whole affair, the Damascus affair, and Rabbi Chaim Palachi was very much involved because he was part of the Ottoman Empire, so they had very strong connection, and he was the one. Now, the Ottomans did not allow the Jews to send letters about this affair to their brothers in Europe because they were afraid that there would be consequences. So he was able to send a letter to Moshe Montefiore in order to involve him in the matter. And in the end, it really was Moshe Montefiore that came to Damascus himself. And he was, as you know, he was extremely rich, extremely powerful, and in the British government. And he was able, more or less, to put down this affair. And Rabbi Chaim Palachi wrote a whole book named Drachav LeMoshe. חיים דרכיו למשה תחילה, ובו תהילות להשר משה מונטיפיורי, with praises to the minister, to the שר משה מונטיפיורי, על פעולתו בעניין עלילת הדם אשר הייתה בערים דמשק ורודוס. So there was also, in Rhodos there was also a local branch of the same blood libel, וסיפור הצלתם, and how they were saved. And also he would speak in length about the chiyuv mitzvah, gmilut chesed vehatzala. So this brought to his mind that Jews should not only walk in local places. We are really a worldwide web, the Jews. He was not the only one who came to this conclusion. Really, the blood libel in Damascus in 1840 is being seen as a milestone in the understanding that the Jews can walk together. Because it's a very interesting phenomenon in Jewish history. Jews in Spain knew that there are Jews in Europe, and Jews in Europe knew that there are Jews in the East. But for some reason, they never thought about just, having a congress of all the Jews. Now, it may be that in the early Middle Ages, it was also very difficult to arrange, the communication were difficult. But even in the 700s, where you can pretty easily already travel from place to place, just never came to their mind that they can really work as one entity. And 1840 was a turning point, not only because they were successful in fighting a local blood libel, but also because they understood that the Jews can operate together. So many historians see that as a precursor of the Zionistic movement, because what was the Zionistic movement if not the understanding of Herzl and others that we can all work, all the Jews from all around the world can work, can have a congress, right, and work together to achieve a mutual goal. So that was very important. Now, he was very far from Zionism, do not misunderstand me, but he also had this insight suddenly that we should work as Jews together. And he has an interesting takana in his takanot for his community. He says, when you give money to poor people, you should also give to Ashkenazim. Now, we may find it funny, but it's a great thing. It's a big thing. If you would remember when the Chida was going around collecting, we spoke about the Chida collecting money, it was very difficult for him to collect money from the Ashkenazim because they would give to someone they know. To this day, by the way, it is better if you come to collect money to look a little like the people you are collecting money from. Because people feel more identification with someone that looks like them. But he understood Now, again, what does it mean? He understood. He always knew, all the Jews always knew that Yemenite Jews and Sephardic Jews and Ashkenaz, we are really all one people. We knew that. But there is a difference between knowing something and feeling it. And it really, this insight penetrated after 1840. We are already after 10. And we started late. So at 18, I don't know what to do. No, in 10 minutes. I would go for another 10 minutes and we'll finish. In 1841, there was a great fire in Izmir. It was not the first one, not the last one, but it destroyed the Jewish quarter, and it destroyed the rabbi's house, Rav Chaim Palachi's house. He was saved, Baruch Hashem, his children were saved, his wife was saved, but he lost no less than 54 Sfarim manuscripts that he wrote. Almost all of his life work was destroyed. He was able to save one manuscript, which was a sefer about Eretz Israel. So it is a sign from heaven about the importance of Eretz Israel. He says, I was devastated. For weeks, I couldn't come up from the bed because it was all of his life work was done. And he said, I would not ever be able to write it again because I wrote it when I was young, when I had time. You remember, till up to the age of 40, I was just sitting and writing. And now I am busy with the public. I don't have the time to rewrite it. So he was really devastated. And his older son, Rabbi Avraham Palachi, came to him and was trying to be Menachem, to consult him a little. And his son began just to ask him, in Brachot Bet Amud Aleph, what have you written? What were you thinking about? And his father would say something. And unknown to the father, the son was walking, every time after speaking with his father, he would go and write some of it. And suddenly he came up to his father and said, I was able to reconstruct one of your Sfarim. Now, obviously, it was not as the original, but the son was able, and the father wrote it, he revived me. Because I understood that it is possible to reconstruct what was lost, even maybe to rethink things. And he came to cope with the loss. So it's a beautiful story. And now, obviously, almost in the introduction of every one of his books, and again, he had 80 books that he did publish, and 54 that were lost. Maybe there is some of the 54 he did reconstruct. But in many of the introductions, he says, that's only a segment of what I had. That's what I'm giving you now is only a segment. He never sold his books. He was giving them for free. He was not interested in earning money from them. He was interested in contributing to Torah. So he was giving free his books. As I said, in the age of 69, he became the Chacham Bashi. He wanted to make Aliyah to Yerushalayim, as his grandfather did, but the community didn't let him. They just didn't let him. So he stayed in Turkey. In the age of 81, in 1868, on Simchat Torah, he was given the Aliyah of Chatan Torah to complete the Torah as a sign of respect. And when he came to Vayamot Sham Moshe Eved Hashem, about the pasuk about the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, he began to cry. And when he began to cry, he was 81, and the whole community began to cry with him. And his sons write later that this was the minute in which he understood that his father is not going to complete this year. And he continued to work and even to write. He wrote the introduction to his last book a day before his death. I mean, we have the date. So a day before his death, he wrote the introduction to his last book. And we have a letter that he wrote in the very last day of his life. So he was sharp and active to his very last day, but he was very sick. And the community wanted to daven for him. He said, I don't want everyone to daven for me. I want you to hire poor people that you'd pay them to pray for me. So even if the prayers won't work, at least tzedakah would be done. So that's again a very noble thought. And then, as I said, in the age of 81, people were very, and his death was something very impressive for the people around, because he was sober to the end, and he just made a bracha, made a kriyat shema, and passed on his bed. And he had an official Turkish levaya, because he was officially a minister of the Turkish government. He had an official with army. People write about it. They were very impressed with shotguns and everything. But he was buried in the Jewish cemetery. Now, just a few words about his legacy. I apologize, but I think it is important. As I said, he wrote 80 books, which is an unbelievable quantity and quality. Unfortunately, his books were not very known. And the reason for that was the decay, if we may say so, of the Turkish Jewish community. We spoke about it a little when we spoke also about Rabbi Yaakov Kuli, about the Elkut Me'am Noez. Now, it's very, very interesting. He writes, as I said, in the middle of the 19th century, and he's still writing about everyone being Shomer Shabbos. 30 years later, it was a completely different game ball. Just the whole thing was changed almost from side to side. A couple of years after his death, they opened an alliance, the Kol Israel Chaverim School. This was a school. This was one of the things that was set in motion by the 80-40 affair. And he didn't understand, as we can never know how history would play out. So he saw it as a chance to, and it was, to strengthen the connections between Jews all around the world. And the Jews in France also saw that way. So the Jews in France said, why should we leave our brothers in their poverty and in their primitive state? Let's enlighten them. So they opened schools, French schools, in all of the Eastern communities. Now, they really had good intentions, and they paid for the schools. But there were modern schools, much better from institutional point of view, from the Chayderim. One thing was completely missing: Yirat Shamayim and Torah learning. And the outcome of these schools was that in a very short time, there was almost a complete erodation of the Jewish piety in the Jewish communities. Very few were able to resist, because these were so nice schools and you got them for free. And very nice Jews from French wanted you, so why not? Why not to use them? And they couldn't see that there was Ra'al, right? Poison. It was a poisoned gift. Now, again, no one wanted it to happen. I don't think that the French didn't really care about them being religious or not. But what happened was that it happened very quickly. The collapse was very, very, very swift. And 100 years after Rav Chaim Palachi wrote his book, so even less, as I said, 50 years afterwards, in Turkey, there was no one almost that cared about what he wrote. And to this day, if you think about that, think about how many Jews you know, let's say, of Jews from Morocco, or from Tunisia, or from Louvre, only here in Tel Mond. How many Jews you know of Yotzei Turkey? There are a few. By the way, in Ra'anana, there was a very nice one. But much, much less. Although it was a very large diaspora, it was a very large community. And that is because, as I said, unfortunately, many of them, they lost connection to Yahadut and to Torah, which is a very sad affair. Now,
Does that lead to the secularization of Turkey?
For sure, and also to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which also caused a great distress, also for the Jews. Yeah, it was, for sure. But the mean to this collapse was mainly by the schools. And again, out of good intentions. I don't want, to be, I'm not in a way in a place to criticize anyone, but that's just what happened. Now, Rabbi Chaim Palachi was a great rabbi. I think it's clear from everything that we read. And he was, as I said, he was a very strong leader. We didn't even speak about some of his takanot, about tzniut, about many things. However, what happened was that in Western Europe, that's a process that took 200 years. And in the meantime, you had people like Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch that spoke about Torah with the Eretz. And we had people that suggested ways to integrate this new modern lifestyle with halacha and with Torah and with Yahadut. And because it happened so quickly in places like Turkey, Rabbi Chaim Palachi was in a place in which he couldn't fathom something like Torah in derech eretz. There was no need for such a thing. And 30 years later, it was too late, almost, to introduce such a thing. So it is almost like speaking about the last minute over the Titanic that doesn't even understand that it is going to collapse into this karchon, right? To this iceberg. So it's a sweet but also bitter speaking about Rabbi Chaim Palachi, because I said he was a great man in a great time. It was a great time to be a Torah Jew in Izmir, but it was really the last minutes over the Titanic. Be'ezrat Hashem, next week I want to speak. Next week there would be no shiur. Excuse me. Next week there will be no shiur. It's the yahrzeit of my father, zichrono livracha, and I would go to the Beit HaKvarot. The week after, I would like to speak about another very interesting rabbi. Almost, it's the other side of the spectrum. Rabbi David Zitzheim. I think I mentioned him here once. He was the head of the Sanhedrin of the Napoleon era. So this is someone that had to deal heads-on with the modern state of things. So Be'ezrat Hashem next week.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Work out.
Yeah,